Greetings. Thank you for joining us for FM360's webinar on Emergency Response Management, a fundamental building block of a facility program. I'm John Rimer, President of FM360. I've been in the facility management industry since 1997 and have served in a number of different industries and a variety of roles. I'm a certified facility manager through IFMA, the International Facility Management Association, and also an IFMA qualified instructor. With respect to emergency response management, preparedness, and business continuity, I have developed and managed multiple programs in a number of environments, including data centers and call centers, biotech, pharmaceutical, and healthcare, corporate and commercial real estate. I've managed emergency command centers and also emergency caches. I've been an incident commander and liaison to stakeholders during emergency events. In today's webinar, we're going to cover why ERM, why do you need a program, and then 5 simple steps to help you implement your own program. So why ERM? Let's look at the impact of a few real-world events that hopefully you are familiar with a lot of them. First, earlier in 2013, I'm sure many of us remember the catastrophic failure and explosion of a plant in West Texas. This image in the top right happened in downtown Lewiston, Idaho in 2012, where a construction worker hit a natural gas pipeline during the day, sending a fireball through the downtown area. Thankfully, the only minor injuries occurred. This image on the top left happened in Tennessee in 2007 when a large boiler exploded. It originally was sitting right where that gentleman is standing in the bottom right of the image. You can see the smokestack above his head. But as a result of the explosion, it busted through that wall and across the manufacturing floor. Thankfully, nobody was there. The back end of that boiler shot out the exterior wall a couple hundred feet and landed in a ditch near the parking lot. The bottom left, Hurricane Sandy. I'm sure many of you have read white papers and the stories that have come out of that, and they continue to share lessons learned and things that we can do better to prepare for events such as these. But you might be thinking, I don't live in a hurricane zone. I'm not a manufacturing plant. So why do I care? Why do I need an emergency response management program? Let's look at the triple bottom line to explore that further. First, you have the financial. That's the most obvious. That if your facility is impacted or shut down, even for something as simple as you have a central plant failure or an HVAC failure, and you've had to evacuate the building for the rest of the afternoon, that's lost productivity. That's loss of revenue. Then you have the social aspect of it. The last thing any company wants is to end up on the news with negative press. But what about the impact that it has on the local community that you operate in, or possibly your clients that you interact with or that your organization sells to? They might lose value, might lose trust, might even lose market share, depending on what type of event occurs. Then there's the environmental aspect. With all the regulations these days and all the lawsuits that come out of environmental spills or events, that has huge catastrophic impact on both the environment, on the social, and on the financial bottom lines. Let's look at the emergency management cycle. First is preparedness. How do you prepare for an emergency? And then you use what you take in preparing to respond to that emergency, and then also to help you through the recovery. We're going to cover each 3 of these steps to some extent in this webinar. And then lastly, mitigation. Let's keep those failures and events from happening to begin with. This can largely be done through a robust maintenance program and capital improvement and replacement program. Step 1, you need to know your business. You need to understand the vision, mission, and goals of your overall organization, the business units within your organization, and then external clients and other occupants. You do this by looking at their business continuity plans, having formal and informal interviews, learning what matters to them, what are their business drivers, how does what you do as facility manager and the systems and the facilities that you operate and maintain affect what they do or possibly are not able to do in order to meet the business demands. Then we align the ERM approach. We establish priorities, we see what needs to be protected, and we identify what really needs to get restored first. What's the sequence? Once we've identified that and have a clear understanding of our business and what matters and what those drivers are, we then have to apply that to our facility. So we have to know our systems. We identify the criticality of the system. How important is it first to personnel and property safety, right? Safety is always first. Second would be direct and indirect impact on production, on the revenue generation side. So is the system directly impacting the means of production, or is it an indirect or support system? Second, how complex are the systems? Is there redundancy? If so, what kind of redundancy? What about interdependency? If system A fails, what impact does that have on system B? If an indirect system fails, as we talked earlier, what impact does it have on a direct system? And then again, what's our redundancy involved with that, or what are the bypasses or whatever it is that we can utilize to maintain our systems? Third, current state and condition. Do you have systems that are end of life? Probably do. How are those part of a critical system? How does that change your confidence level in those, especially in an emergent situation? So that may adjust how you, one, of course, maintain that equipment, but two, how you respond and maybe where that equipment or those systems are on your priority list because of their current state and condition. Lastly, you need to look at failure modes. I call it playing the what if. So what happens if this fails? Well, what does this do? More formally, you could do a failure modes and effects analysis, FMEA, or you could also apply some of the principles from RCM, Reliability-Centered Maintenance, or in this case, SRCM, which is Streamlined Reliability-Centered Maintenance. That's typically the approach that I use in looking at the critical systems and break those systems down into their equipment and into components and identifying what are the single points of failure, what's going to get you, and figure out then how to mitigate those risks or at least prepare for those failures. Once we've identified the criticalities of systems, we can move on to developing the EOPs, or the emergency operating procedures. For example, one of the first emergency operating procedures I always start off with is loss of utility power. What do you do? What systems do you go verify that are still operating once you lose utility power? What do you do if one of those systems isn't operating as it should? For example, should the generator not start? That would be a separate emergency operating procedure. And then when utility power restores, you have a process for how to sequence the systems on and verify that they did an auto start, or if you have to bring them on manually, how do you do that? Those are all a variety of procedures depending on the complexity and size of your facility. In writing EOPs, I usually start off with the header. Who? Who can do it? Who's qualified to perform this particular procedure? Are there safety concerns? Do they have the lockout tagout that they need to do? Is there confined space requirements? Whatever it is, those need to be identified. Is there PPE or personal protective equipment required in order for them to safely perform this procedure? That should be identified. And then do they need any tools? Tools to maybe open up a panel or a control panel. And then, of course, you need to identify either the location and or equipment for which this procedure applies. You do not want the wrong procedure being used on the wrong equipment. Next, I get into the steps. And this is literally a step-by-step process. You leave nothing out. And with each step, you identify the expected outcome. Turn the switch to manual operation. When you do, an amber indicator will illuminate, or an audible alarm will sound, so that the operator knows what to expect and is not caught off guard or surprised. Conversely, if they're following the procedure and something doesn't go the way that it should because it's not meeting the expected outcome, they may realize that there is something else going on, and they possibly need to back out of that procedure. The approach to developing EOPs is first assess. When you arrive to an event or situation, you assess what's going on. Noises, smells, what lights, etc. What do you see, hear, smell, feel? First, safety. Is it safe to be there? Second, contain and isolate. If you can safely move in to contain whatever is going on or to isolate that event so that you mitigate or minimize further damage to the space or to the systems, you do that. Next, you bypass the failed system or switch over to the backup system if it has not already done so on its own. Once you've restored, hopefully, services through a bypass or a backup, you repair the failed system and equipment, and then ultimately you restore normal operations. Now, this process or this approach may involve a couple of different emergency operating procedures just for one system. For example, you may have an EOP for how to contain and isolate a system, or possibly how to bypass or switch it to a backup, for example, switching over to the backup generator. And then you likely will have a separate procedure for how to restore to normal operations. There is a very clear process and sequence that you would need to follow in order to do it successfully.